Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on leadership in the era of rolling crises. I hope that we will leave this room in 45 minutes feeling a little more positive than the title might imply. My name is Matina Stevis-Gridneff. I'm the Brussels Bureau Chief of the New York Times, and I'm joined by a really distinguished panel. I'll quickly introduce them before we start talking about the substance and a little bit of housekeeping for this morning. To my left, I have Corinne Momal-Vanian. She's the Executive Director of the Kofi Annan Foundation. To my right, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, who's the President of the Open Society Foundations. Mr. Maurice Levy, the Chairman of the Supervisory Board of the Publicis Group, and Mr. Simon Freakley, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Alex Partners. We talk about rolling crises, and the miracle that we're here today kind of shows resilience and how we're able to overcome them, but it's also all we're talking about while we're here, going from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine and whatever happens next. This is a sort of feature of our time that seems to be becoming baked into our reality. And it's a huge challenge for leaders of all kinds of organizations in the business and corporate world and civil society and, of course, political leadership, how to tackle those disruptions and those crises that bring a huge amount of upheaval internally as well as in operating environments. One of the things we're going to try and tease out in our conversation today is the role of the toolbox that leaders traditionally get in this constant flux and unpredictability that can be extremely destructive. And hopefully we can try and identify potential for opportunity in that context. But we're also going to try and talk a little more about the philosophy of leadership and what should the goals be, more on the conservative side or a little more on the creative and innovative side. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get to some real world examples as well as bigger ideas, and I really would welcome your participation and encourage it here in the room, which is a blessing that we're able to be here together, but also for those who are watching online. A couple of housekeeping points before we get to it. The one is, if you're following online and you want to share thoughts on social media, please do so by using the hashtag WEF2022. And we will be collecting questions for the final part of our conversation today from online. We will also be taking questions from the room. If you're following online, I really would welcome those questions, and I'm just going to explain how you can submit them. You can submit them at any point while we're speaking. In fact, it would be great if you submit them earlier so we can review them and make sure that I get them on my iPad to put them to our participants. If you're using the Slido app, you will see the directions on how to submit your question on the screen, but basically to do that, you have to open your camera on your smartphone and point it at the QR code, and then the QR code will be displayed on the screen, and you'll be able to follow simple instructions to submit your questions. We've also prepared a couple of polling questions to get everyone warmed up and involved. I hope it's not asking too much of y'all to participate in those, and perhaps we can just start with our first one before we get to talking among our panelists. So the first polling question for today that I would really love to get your thoughts on is, what should the goal of leadership in this era of permacrisis be? Should it be resilience and sort of cementing strengths, which is a more conservative approach, I suppose? Should it be agility, being nimble and able to navigate those crises? Or should it be innovation and leaning into that disruption to bring your organization to sort of a cutting edge? We'll give you a couple of minutes to respond to those questions, and we'll integrate your thoughts in our discussion. Let's now just turn to talking. I'll start with you, Corinne, and I'd love to get all your thoughts on this. One of the issues that we're really seeing play out constantly in this era of constant crisis is that sort of traditional leadership tools are not really fit for purpose. They're not working. There's playbooks out there, and they don't seem to be delivering for leaders facing really moving sands. And I wonder if we can sort of turn that issue on its head, and if I can ask you, what do you think the outcome that leaders should be pursuing at the moment should be? What do you think the goal should be?
I think we still look at leadership the wrong way around. We are so conditioned to think of heroes who are going to save us, the myth of the great man who's going to come and save us, that we're failing to look at collective leadership. As a child, I walked past the Pantheon in Paris on my way to school, and it has on its facade this inscription. It says, "To great men, the nation is grateful." Men, of course, not women. But so it's so ingrained that it's very difficult for us to break away from this. But the truth is that what we need today is collective leadership that happens through very clunky and unsexy institutions such as the UN, such as the European Union. The UN gave us the Paris Agreement on climate change. The European Commission and Parliament gave us the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, and these are real achievements. And in fact, I keep this gavel on my desk. It's a replica of the gavel that was used in Paris to hammer in the Paris Agreement, because for me, it's a way to remember that collective leadership is possible and can deliver. The problem we have is that the institutions are clunky, they're too slow as the crisis accelerate. And the problem is also that the enmity between the big powers mean that the smallest common denominator is getting smaller all the time. So is not delivering anymore the consensus at the level that it can reach, it can really deliver effective solutions. So what we need is, we do need the individual leaders, the heroes, but who are going to make sure to elevate this consensus. And if you want real life examples, you won't be surprised if I cite Kofi Annan, of course. When the HIV/AIDS crisis rolled through Africa, devastating lives, he put all stakeholders together around the table, including Big Pharma, to get to a solution. And the solution was a war chest that would provide access to the antiretroviral treatment that existed, but that most people in Africa in particular could not afford. So he put them all together, created the war chest, it became the Global Fund. And this is the kind of leadership we need today, not singular heroes who through innovation and technology and all these things are important, but people who are going to make this collective decision-making possible.
Right. Maurice, it sounds like what Corinne is saying is that the clunky, unsexy tools we have can still deliver, but there's potentially a lack of bravery in leaning into those. Does that ring true to you?
There are different type of crises. When you have the classic crisis that we have been confronted with, where every company has had to face a product that we have to recall or anything of the like, you have a toolbox which is working pretty well. But when you are with a crisis like the pandemic, which is absolutely unknown, and you have to make decision and immediate decision, because on 16th of March, everything is shut down. You cannot have a meeting with 20 people or 30 people. You have to make a decision immediately. And the decision, I'm going back to what you said, I think it's much more a philosophy of management, a philosophy of leadership, rather than a toolbox. It is based on, finally, when you are confronted with this kind of crisis, two elements. One is, what is the major priority? Protect the people. So it's relatively easy. The only thing that you have to think about is how I will protect my people. And the second is the clarity with which I'm working. So it is based, in fact, in two elements. One which is empathy, and the second which is clarity. And I will take just one example to show how clarity is not working sometimes, because people like to have some decisions which are black and white. And you take the example in New York of some banks who have said, okay, you have to go back to the office. And it has been almost an order to all the people. They didn't come back. They had to renegotiate. It would have been much better to negotiate before. And that is because they lacked empathy. So you have to look at the situation as it is and to react based on your human values and the values of the company. So I consider that when you look at all the crises that we went through since the 70s, and sorry, I have a background of crisis, and I have been with the first oil shock in 74, and I have been through, and every single crisis is different. And you have to make decisions which are right for the company, and every time is different. And today, for example, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, when you look at the numbers for a company, very often these represent small numbers. The business that we do in Ukraine represent less than 1%, in Ukraine less than 1%, and in Russia 1%. So the decision that we have to take has nothing to do with the numbers. It has to do with the values and how do we behave. How do we help the Ukrainian getting out of the countries, making sure that they are helped, that they are paid even if they are not at job, and that their family are not suffering from the material issues, and at the same time being quite clear with Russia and say, okay, we don't like what you are doing. It has nothing to do with business. It has to do with values. And the time where we were saying business for business is over. It is about values, and if you don't take into account those values, you are making big mistakes.
Right. Characteristically, the Frenchman is talking about emotional intelligence, and I think that's interesting. And leaning into empathy, I think, is an interesting concept. And we've heard a lot about empathy being quite a necessary leadership skill in this era, and also one that sometimes is lacking very distinctly. There's limited space now for leaders who don't display actively empathy. Simon, do you think that this idea of protecting people, protecting our people, sticking to our values in rolling crises that are really challenging those and questioning those is a priority?
I think it's a really important priority. I think in a multi-stakeholder world, employees, customers, financial stakeholders, other stakeholders, people want to know the purpose for your organization and the values that matter to your organization that drive your decisions. They want to know what informs your decisions, and any crisis, any particular situation will require a response. But if your stakeholders know the values that you base your decisions on, I think it gives them a sense of security and also know who they're dealing with. You know, Corinne talked about individual heroics. And I think, in truth, group heroics trump individual heroics every single time. So even in the wonderful example of Kofi Annan, he was the leader amongst a group of heroes that made something happen. And I think that's generally true in business as well as in politics. I think the pressure on business leaders now is enormous. It's not that the fundamentals of leadership are different. People need to have a vision. They need to know why it matters, what the purpose of the vision is, and why it's possible to get there. But there are more stakeholders to be aware of now than ever before. CEOs have to talk about, environmental issues, social issues, governance issues, as well as speak to their stakeholders about issues of economic return. The cycles of disruption, the crises that repeat, seem to be quickening. So whilst we'd always worry about whether we were heading into a recession or we're going for a period of growth, federal agencies have now become very practiced at managing economic cycles. So the cycles of the disruption have become more regular and more profound than the economic cycles. And of course, even though we don't know what the next crisis is, the next disruption is, what we do know is that it's coming, and we have to prepare ourselves and be a values-based organization that can deal with those crises when they land.
Mark, I guess values is the driving force of your organization, but in terms of navigating the landscape that's forever changing, what would you say is the number one goal?
Well, again, picking up this twice reference now to Kofi, who I was lucky enough to be his deputy at the end of his time as Secretary General. And, you know, I would say that, as Corinne, who also worked for him, has, you know, indicated, I mean, it was, remember this, he was Secretary General at a time of war. We had Bush, we had Tony Blair, we had Putin, we had a bunch of these characters strutting their stuff. And, you know, his leadership style was so contrasted to these other leaders who were racing ahead and looking over their shoulder and suddenly finding that people weren't behind them. And his quiet, consensus-building approach, I think, struck us all as really remarkable. And, you know, the only leader at the time who unfortunately got humiliated by the administration he chose to serve in, who matched it in any way, was Colin Powell. And, you know, it was really remarkable to see these two individuals continually trying to find shared ways through the complexity of the problems we faced. Now, they were both values-driven individuals. And I would just say this, because, you know, I think when we get the answers to these questions, we'll find, well, this won't reflect it, but I saw amongst my colleagues at Open Society Foundations over the last year and a half, if they had had to vote on this question during the crisis, they would have preferred resilience over agility or innovation. And I think that's probably true in any organization, because the security of the job, the hope that the organization is going to survive, is obviously going to prevail, while the challenge of leadership is actually agility and innovation. Because, you know, if you don't have those, you know, however much you protect jobs, however much you know, promise people that things are going to go on as usual, right, the institution will fail. And so consensus is right at one point, and then suddenly it isn't right, as Maurice said. And it needs, you know, some quite brave individual leadership or top group leadership. So I think it's not, you know, and what links the two from when you do have to make those lonely decisions to when you actually want to encourage decisions to come from the wider community of colleagues. It is values. Mm-hmm. It is a coherence of values which make your colleagues finally understand, we don't like that decision, but it's right.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you spoke about the agility versus resilience question, because we have the poll results, and thanks to everyone who participated. And it seems that agility has been identified by those of you kind enough to participate, and thanks for that, as the top goal of leadership in this era. And a close second is innovation, being able to roll with the punches and make something out of it. And in fact, resilience is a distant third. So
only leaders here, you see.
Well. Yeah, and hopefully sort of agreeing with that, prioritizing, because it seems that what you were trying to say is that actually being agile, being innovative in these environments will take care of resilience, yeah, will bring the resilience for the ship to navigate that bad weather.
If you go back to the toolbox and you look at previous crises, and you will say, okay, what I have done during the crisis of 2008 to 2012, and you want to apply the same to the pandemic, it will not work. Mm-hmm. It will not work, because in 2008 you had the economic crisis and the financial crisis, and what you had to do is to protect massively the company. And that was paramount. When you go to the pandemic, it was about protecting people. They had to go back home. They couldn't work at the office. You had to provide immediately computers and all the services in order that they can work from home. And you have to make sure that they feel safe and that they have not to worry about their future, and they have not to worry, and everything is taken care of in order that they feel that they can go through the pandemic, I wouldn't say nicely, but at least without suffering too much. And this is something which make a difference at the end of the pandemic, which is not yet there. But when you look at the war for talent, there are the companies who have behaved brutally, and there are the companies who have behaved differently. And in that war of talent, the people who have behaved with a humanistic approach are the ones who are getting a better share of talent than the other ones.
Right.
And that is paramount for
Right.
the future of the company.
Right. I want to switch gears a little bit and come back to you, Corinne. I think it's sort of a real starting point in identifying a crisis, seeing how it affects your organization, and figuring out what to do next is information. And it feels like, and I don't say this as someone who works in legacy media, but I say it as someone who deals in this very thick fog of misinformation every day, trying to understand and work out. That's what we do at the New York Times, and I think that's what a lot of people outside the media business do, and leaders have to do every single day. Accessing that information is becoming incredibly difficult. And can you talk a little bit about misinformation, disinformation, and how it impacts the decision-making landscape?
I mean, we're obviously very concerned about the sort of sludge of disinformation and hate speech that has been unleashed on social media. And we had recently in Geneva Maria Ressa, who is the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and she has a very pessimistic view of things, actually. She says that basically that the tech companies have destroyed democracy by destroying facts. She says that a bomb has exploded in our information ecosystem, and that we've let all this happen because we've allowed tech companies to base their business model on the manipulation of our emotions. I'm a bit less pessimistic because maybe because I don't live in the Philippines, and where a second Marcos has just been elected after a campaign of disinformation. But I think we're learning. We're learning through appropriate legislation such as the European Digital Services Act, very important, has to be emulated in many other parts of the world. We're learning also that it's not the leaders who can fight disinformation. And I think that's also one important point, because they're not trusted anyway. So if they say, no, you have to be rational, don't believe the conspiracy theories, the wild disinformation, people are not going to believe it. So we need a whole of society approach to fighting disinformation. And that's one of the things we do, for instance, in Kenya, in securing the digital environment ahead of the next election, is to work with traditional media, with legacy media, with NGOs, with students, academics, political parties as well, to try and put out a counter-narrative and fight the disinformation. So we're learning to do this. The problem is that we're always a step behind. And even as we learn to use the very tools of disinformation, AI, to detect it and counter it, we're always a step behind. And at the end of the day, disinformation is not about pushing one truth or one untruth. It's really about creating divides. So what we need is leaders who can bridge the divides, because this is what disinformation intends to do. And we see that the crisis at the moment are increasing the divides instead of bridging them. And we wasted the opportunity of the 2008 global financial crisis to bridge the divides. In fact, they have increased. Let's not waste this crisis, and let's make sure that we bridge the divides, because then I think the disinformation crisis will go away by itself. Because people don't necessarily want to believe absurd things. They just don't trust their leaders. And we've heard it over and over again here yesterday, this morning, from the young people in particular.
Can I pick up on that point?
Yeah, please do, yeah.
And I think we all accept, and it's real, that technology has driven the potential to do a lot of this misinformation. But I think whilst technology itself has disrupted the news, it's the connectivity that's accelerated that. If you think that in the world there's over 3 billion smart devices, so the connectivity that's made possible for people to be able to curate their own news ecosystem that plays to their own, not just their value system, but also their preferences in terms of what type of news they want. I think this creates this dysmorphia And so whilst technology has been the cause of it, the connectivity has been the accelerant of it. And I think we haven't really yet understood where that will take us.
A lot of uncertainty still. I was planning to come to you, but I think I'll go to you first, because we spoke even in the green room about this double-edged sword of technology, and I know that this is something you deal with every day in your professional work, and so intellectually you're very engaged with that. Can you talk a little more about how to get technology to be on the helpful and positive side for leaders and for entire organizations?
I don't know if we'll be able to say how it can be on the positive side, but how we can use it. And it is a good segue to what Corinne has said regarding, and also Simon, regarding social networks, fake news, and complotism, and all that kind of news which are circulating. I will take the example of what we have done. I think it's more, it's not to do some publicity about publicists, but it is just to explain exactly how we have behaved. We are building a tool for internal communication. And when the pandemic arrived, we decided not only to do it, but to accelerate dramatically, because we have to move from roughly 300 offices to 86,000 offices, because everyone has his own office and work from his computer. So we have built a tool which is called Marcel, which is based on artificial intelligence, where everyone is connected. That tool was already working for our client and for delivering the work. So we decided that instead of just using it as a tool to deliver the work, we will use it as an internal communication tool. And we have today 90,000 people connected. And what happened during the crisis is three things, which are extremely important. The first one is that we have saved jobs, because we were able to use the talent wherever they were to work on projects that were elsewhere. And we have posted gigs where we were saying, okay, I have this campaign to do, who is available to do it? And we had an incredible support of all the people. The second was for communication, real crisis communication. Because of the fake news, we decided that we will speak directly to everyone. And we had a weekly communication made by the CEO. He was speaking, after having discussed with his team, directly to the 90,000 people of our organization every single Sunday. He was posting a video and answering questions. The last thing is when the George Floyd problem and drama happened, instead of just putting a knee on the floor, we decided that we will pause for action. And during one day, we had our 23,000 people in the US connected and exchanging on what that was meaning for their own jobs, how they were behaving themselves toward their colleagues, why they were not opening up to more diversity, what were the issues with the women, etc., etc. And all this has changed dramatically the way we were operating. And we are doing this now every quarter. We have a day which is pause for action, where we can connect with each region separately. And last but not least, is that with that kind of approach, we show openness and transparency. You were talking about trust. Trust is not something that you can declare. Trust me. Leave that to the politician. In our world, trust is something you win. There is a French poet who said, "There is no love, there is only proofs of love." It's the same for trust. There is no trust that you can gain just by being who you are. People can credit you, but you have to earn that trust. And you earn not with words, but with act and actions. And you build on the action. And what we have done with that tool is just unbelievable. We would not have been able to achieve that even if we had 2 or 3 years to do it. And this happened just like this. And that is the magic of the tool, the technology,
Sure.
the fact that you can connect, as you said, Simon, immediately. And obviously, it's like in the old days when you were developing a tool on IT, there was an expression which was, I cannot say it, but what you put inside is what you get outside.
Sure.
I will not use
Thanks for sparing us that.
And I'm saving that. And this is exactly what's happening when you are using those tools. And you build trust, and therefore, the bad news, the stories, the compotism, etc., which is happening and circulating in the net, is something where people look at it with a distance and they can make a difference.
Sure. Let me get to Mark. I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about inclusive leadership and the kind of distance between virtue signaling and everyone talking about inclusion and trying to keep their people on board and actually doing it. Your organization is sort of, the raison d'etre of your organization is that kind of inclusion. But how do you do it as a leader?
Just a word on that last subject and then coming straight to that. You know, as a human rights-based organization fighting for democracy, and that's our purpose, you know, we now put this broken media issue right in our top 3 or 4 priorities, and we are doing a huge amount of advocacy around social media regulation through grantees around the world. We're doing a huge amount of grant making to keep good investigative journalism alive, not just in the pages of the New York Times, but through all of those groups like ICIJ and all the others who are working so hard to bring important stories out that today don't get the kind of same investigative teams they used to have deployed on them. And the third thing we're doing is using our power as with a large endowment as an investor to really look at how we can invest in media. And I suspect we'll find it's going to be small, new, startup social media, particularly, to build pluralism in media content. Not to become another media proprietor in the old style, but to, you know, try and find and help the sector find smart, financially viable models for the future, and to use our own investment power to help join that journey and make it work for others. Turning quickly to the inclusion point. Yeah, I mean, look, in a strange way, in an organization like the United Nations where I used to work, you know, we'd been doing inclusion forever because, you know, if you don't, you know, it just doesn't work. The persuasion powers needed, the empathy to the development situations or humanitarian situations you face around the world, those skills are just missing. If it's the bunch of monogamous, that's not the word I mean. That's never been applied to the UN before. Homogeneous, that's what I'm looking for. Homogeneous people, you know, you need diversity, and, you know, we were always did it. And, you know, in a strange way, the UN, which is very rarely thought to lead on anything, on that always did. Coming to an organization like Open Society, it has been naturally very diverse because, again, it's been recruited in a way that's intended to reflect the world it serves. But, you know, I always get worried when the diversity issue gets detached from the organizational performance issue, because really, ultimately, that is the test of diversity. It's you've got to look like the world you're seeking to help. And if you meet that test, there's no amount of box ticking in the background, which is a substitute for that. You know, and I have already, in the year and a half I've been there, you know, been at pains to build a more diverse leadership group and to make sure that there is diversity across our recruitment. But again, it's less, you know, to get sort of internal praise for that. It's more about, if we're going to be an effective organization in today's world, we need to be younger and we need to be there, which is part of being more representative of today's world, but you've got to have a matching diversity as well.
Right.
Can I just
Go ahead,
say
sure.
one thing about youth inclusion? Because it's true that the UN, where I worked for a long time, was always diverse by design, and rightly so. But where it completely failed was in being representative of younger generations. I mean, the junior officers were 40 years old, and that was considered really young and immature. You know, so
No, for 40-year-olds here, you're very young.
yes, of course. But I mean, there are more people to be born in the world in this century than are currently alive. And 85% of those will live in Asia and Africa, and they'll be impacted by the decisions we take today. And the UN, but all other institutions have failed so far to reflect that diversity. So we have to, that is really, really important for, diversity is not only about geography or gender, it's also about age groups.
I'd love to keep talking about the UN as someone who spent a big chunk of my career in East Africa and criticize them. But I want to bring us back down a bit to the crisis question, because I understand that one of the things your organization does is try to build sort of some predictiveness around disruption, which to me sounds sort of oxymoronic. Disruption is by nature unpredictable. So can you, before I turn to you guys for questions from the audience, I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Thank you. And of course, you're right. I mean, forecasting is a tool that's been used for many, many years, looking at the future, largely based on trends from the past. Trying to work out what is going to happen next in the cycles of disruption is something you can't forecast. And so at Alex Partners, what we do is spend a lot of time understanding how to make organizations resilient when those disruptions and those crises happen. So, for instance, every year we do a survey of chief executives around the world, 3,000 chief executives around the world, and ask them what's top of mind for them, what they worry about most, what are in their top 10 concerns. Some interesting statistics. This year, 94% of respondents, 3,000 chief executives, said that their business models, their current business models, would not survive 3 years, that they had to reinvent themselves within 3 years. A huge statistic. 72% of the chief executives felt that their jobs were at risk because of the profound uncertainties that they're dealing with. And that's a 20-point jump in 12 months. And so what we're seeing is the impact of repeated disruptions, repeated crises. So you're right, you can't forecast them, but what you can do is look at what, in leadership terms and organizational terms, makes organizations resilient to those crises and disruptions when they happen, and how to capitalize on the opportunities in those disruptions, not just mitigate the threats. And so just in case as well as just in time, making sure that chief executives are their own chief communication officers, in the example that Morris gave about the weekly communications, being right on the front foot, led by values but addressing things head on, making sure that pace is there over perfection. So do it nearly right, but do it now, because with repeated cycles of crisis and disruptions, you don't have the luxury of planning. Even the Chinese government doesn't do 50-year plans anymore. So it's all about being prepared for those cycles of disruption and crisis.
Right. Thank you for all these really valuable thoughts. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the room before we have to wrap it up. So I'm going to go behind me because I've turned my, I do feel awful for turning my back on you. Thank you. Please just keep it brief, introduce yourself, and just make sure there's a question in there that someone can respond to.
Thank you. My name is Adam, and I'm a global shipper. I'm also a businessman, and I'm the 3rd generation of a food supply business in West Africa. During the crisis, we had to let go about 30% of our crew members. And during the weekend, I have to go back to the people and advocate about getting vaccination. My question is to Mr. Levy. I would like to know how can I rebuild the trust? Because once the trust is lost, it's very hard to get it back. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's one of the toughest questions possible. Because when you have lost trust, it's extremely, extremely difficult to gain it back, and you have to do it by being true to your words in your action. So everything that you do has to really be in accord with the values that you have developed, everything that you have built and said, and you have to be absolutely true to your values and your words. And if in the action they see a difference, they don't trust you anymore. So to rebuild it, you have to go again and again and again and prove, and you have to win it.
Thanks, Maurice. One more question for
You
sure.
have behind you.
Oh, yes, please. Hi. Hi, Natalia.
Hello, my name is Natalia. I'm global shaper from Ukraine. 2 years ago, we made our decision at the national level about the lockdown. And now the war started. Let's imagine that 6 of us, we are running a middle-sized company in Ukraine. And we want to relocate all our employees to another country. But they don't want to move. What would be our action plan in that case? Thank you.
Oh, wow. Mark.
I can tell you what we have
Mark.
done.
Yeah, well, it's the same. We have a big foundation in Ukraine. We just evacuated from Afghanistan and Myanmar over the previous year. I thought it would be the same thing, that our staff would want to leave. Not at all with your fellow Ukrainians. And ultimately, I concluded that it was right to warn them of the risks of staying in Kiev, to start a new office in Lviv and allow those who wanted to free accommodation in Berlin. In other words, there was a home for them if they wanted to leave. About half moved to Lviv, half stayed in Kiev, or a third and a third and a third, less than a third, a quarter, perhaps left the country. But, I felt ultimately in this situation where the country as a whole was choosing to fight an invader, it would not be true to our values as a human rights defender and a democracy defender to force people to leave. They wanted to be part of that response, and we needed to let them be. So warn them of the danger, have supported them intensively in country, and been enormously proud of what they've done, and they continue to work and operate and make loans because we've created a big fund for Ukraine, and they're doing a fantastic job, and I'm pleased I didn't exercise old-fashioned leadership and tell them to leave.
Maurice, you wanted to say something, and I'd love to squeeze in one last question.
Pretty quickly, what we have done. The first thing is that we have told all our people in Ukraine that they will be paid until the end of the year, even if they have to go to the army or whatever. We have not asked them to work. You said, okay, you have to defend your country, and your family has to be safe and has to be quiet on the financial aspect and the material aspect. The second thing that we have done is for all the people who wanted to move, that we have offered job in the countries in Europe. And they have received more offers that the people wanted to move. And the last thing that we have done is to offer them to work from their country, like we work from home on matters which are for the UK, for France, for Germany, or for any other country. So currently our people, and hopefully they will be safe, are not having a material issue, and they are protected, which is what we wanted to do.
Thanks so much, and I'm terribly sorry I've not been able to take more questions or hear more thoughts, but being given the flag that we're down to 50 seconds. I'm super appreciative of everyone's participation, in particular our panelists, but people watching remotely and everyone here in the room. I think we're going away thinking more about the next crisis or the features of the continuation of the current crisis, and we hear about the prognostications every day, and part of my role is to write about them. But I really appreciate you sharing with us your thoughts on empathy and inclusion, on navigating that very difficult information landscape, and on sort of understanding disruption a bit more as a feature of this time and trying to roll with the punches. It seems to be the message for today. Thanks so much for this panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.